Hello and good evening, good morning and good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are in the world today. You see there's a lot of people who are around Australia, but we've also got a lot of guests joining the webinar internationally. So welcome everybody to the third in our webinar series supporting the offshore wind industry here in Australia. And a really hot topic for today, and it's understanding marine mammal survey data for the purpose of project approvals offshore wind farms. So if we just move, we'll move through a few of the intro slides today. I'll give you, as well as the welcome just now, we'll just run through a brief acknowledgement of the country. I'll give you a small introduction or a short introduction to who the APEM Group are for those of you who may not be familiar with us. I'll then run through each of the esteemed panel, the experts we have here today to talk throughout this webinar. And I'll hand over to Ross, who will be running through the presentations. We'll then have a final sort of panel discussion where we'll get an opportunity to raise questions between the panel, as well as questions that you can yourselves throw into the chat or the Q&A, which you'll see at the top of your Teams screens there. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for just a mini wrap up and any actions. But any questions that you do have and that you do put in, if we don't get the opportunity to answer today, we do intend to both send out a summary of the answers that we can provide to those questions that you might have after the event. And we'll also send through a link to the recording. So if any of your colleagues don't get the chance to see this webinar today, then you will get that opportunity. Hopefully that'll be tidied up and sent out to you next week. And if you do, for any reason, have to leave early, then at least you can go back and see that again. So if we could just go to the next slide. If we just, so an acknowledgement of the country here across Australia. And so the APEM Group and the panel here today, we recognise that the first people of this nation and their ongoing connection to culture and country. We acknowledge First Nations peoples as the traditional owners, custodians, and lawkeepers of the world's oldest living culture, and pay respects to their elders past and present. I would just like to say a thank you to Raquel as well for sharing and letting us use this acknowledgement of country. It's one from Energize Renewables, and this artwork was commissioned by them for this particular one. So thank you again, Raquel, for letting us use that today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the APEM Group, I'll whiz through this fairly sharply because I do want to get to the main event. We're a global independent environmental consultancy of scientific expertise in many different topic areas, and the focal point today is really around marine mammals, that data collection and support for offshore wind farms and renewable energy in the offshore space. But we provide many different services, including digital aerial survey, environmental impact assessments, terrestrial ecology, navigational risk assessments, etc., etc. And that's really in support of the offshore wind farm. That's on every step of the life cycle of an offshore wind farm, from site feasibility and selection through the environmental survey and data collection analyses, that interpretation and modelling that might go on through the environmental impact assessments, securing your approvals, and then what do you do after your approvals in that sort of post-approval space when the construction of an offshore wind farm, the operational phase, and believe it or not, from a UK perspective now, we're also strongly involved in some of the decommissioning and have been involved in monitoring projects for over 20 years now. And next slide, please. So our sort of global experience, and we bring together that global experience and here in Australia with a team that also provides that local knowledge as well. We've been the lead on offshore wind projects for the amount of over 50 gigawatts of energy now globally. Most of that is within Europe. We've undertaken over 1,500 digital aerial surveys. We've got a team of over 200 specialists who are dedicated resource to support the offshore wind industry, particularly offshore wind farms. And we've, in the last 10 years, we've completed the two largest offshore marine wildlife digital aerial survey projects, both off the east coast of the US. We developed the first digital aerial survey correction factor for availability bias for marine mammals for ensuring that those robust population estimates are available for use to characterise the baseline and feed into those impact assessments. And for the last 6 years, we've been collecting both marine mammal observer data via vessels, surveys, as well as digital aerial data from marine mammals across Gippsland for many projects as well. I'm going to give you a quick intro to our panel. So we have myself. I didn't introduce myself earlier, so I'm Sean Sweeney, Associate Director and Offshore Wind Lead for the APEM Group here in Australia. I've worked for the APEM Group for around 13 years now, more widely as an ornithologist and EIA specialist, and with consultancy experience for over 20 years now, and one of the world's leading specialists in marine wildlife data collection, analysis and reporting, with particular emphasis on understanding the impacts of offshore renewable energy projects on birds. I'm based here in Melbourne. I've been involved in the EIA process, pre-construction operation, decommissioning for around 60 offshore wind farms globally, presenting the results of different studies in scientific papers and conferences, and including some for marine mammals as well, actually. And I've worked on multiple Australian offshore wind farm projects, including Star of the South, Greater Eastern, and a number of other Gippsland projects that we're currently unable to name due to confidentiality. And I'm really proud to be representing the APEM Group today for another of our offshore wind webinar series, and representing the group as chair today. One from myself, we have Ross Culloch, who's Associate Director and APEM Group's Head of Marine Mammals based in Scotland. And Ross is a marine mammal specialist with over 20 years experience, including 9 years in renewable energy projects. And he's made a significant contribution to marine mammal research and consultancy, supporting offshore wind developments, and also through his former advisory role to the Scottish Government on marine mammal issues, contributing to offshore wind projects in Scottish waters. And he's instrumental in advancing the science behind decision-making for offshore wind developments through initiatives like the Scottish Marine Energy Renewable Forum. Through his collaborative approach, working with academia, statutory advisors and industry stakeholders, and this has really been crucial in addressing those knowledge gaps, driving innovative solutions in marine mammal research, including collision risk modelling for tidal projects, telemetry studies and population analyses for marine mammals. Next up on the panel, we'll have Ali Cotton, who's Associate Director in our Marine Wildlife Survey team in the APEM Group. Ali's a New Zealander who spent a lot of time in the UK on offshore wind farm projects, but is now based in Perth in Western Australia. And she has extensive experience in conservation research, science, data analysis and policy across the private, academic, NGO and government sectors. She's worked for the APEM Group for the last 2 years, whilst previously had a strong background in conservation science and evolutionary genetics, both in research and university lecturing. Alongside her will be Jonathan Bowler, who is a team leader in zoology at Biosis, where he's worked for the last 4 years. Jono is a South African by birth and is a dedicated zoologist with extensive experience in ecological research consultancy. His work involves leading zoological assessments and coordinating projects that can contribute to the understanding and conservation of Australia's unique wildlife. And before joining Biosis, he worked in research for marine predator ecology at Deakin University in Australia, and also at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, where he gained valuable experience in marine ecology and predator-prey dynamics. He also leads multiple boat-based survey programs in Australia, collecting marine mammal data to inform the planning and development of offshore wind projects across Gippsland. And aside from Jono, we have really pleased to welcome Raquel Carter here as well. She's the head of Western Australian Environment for Energized Renewables, based in Perth, over in Western Australia. And she is a marine environmental scientist, regulatory specialist and environmental impact assessment practitioner, specialising in coastal and marine development sectors. Raquel has worked in Australia's offshore energy regulator, NOPSEMA, and has held several roles, including NOPSEMA's Chief Environmental Scientist, Environment Manager, NOPSEMA Inspector, and Environmental Specialist. And prior to working for the federal government, she was employed in the WA state government and natural resource management groups, as well as spending over 6 years working in the NGO sector, building and strengthening partnerships between government, community, and industry to deliver projects that have multiple benefits across a range of stakeholders. And finally, last but not least, we have Lorenzo Scala. He's a senior marine scientist at SAISH Limited, based in the UK. And he's been with SAISH for around 17 years now, with experience across the offshore industry, including the last 8 years specifically in offshore wind. And he specialises in passive acoustic monitoring, including marine mammal acoustic studies and underwater noise measurement and mitigation during offshore construction activities. He's also involved in the design, operational planning, data collection and analysis of marine mammal and underwater noise data sets. And that's the panel. I will now happily pass on to Ross, who can finalise the introductions and then start off the presentation. So thank you all again for joining, and I will hand over to you, Ross.
Thanks very much, Sean. Really appreciate that. Yeah, I won't linger on this too long, but just to give an aim of the workshop, if you like, or the webinar rather, is just to go through understanding some of those key issues for EIA, which are really underpinned by regulatory frameworks and guidance. Moving on to looking at the commonly used surveys, giving an overview of those methods and approaches, and ultimately tying all that together to consider the aspects that are important for ensuring data are fit for purpose. So without lingering on this any further, I'll pass over to Raquel, who's going to take the first part of that first bullet point in essence. Thanks very much, Raquel.
Thank you, Ross, and good evening, morning or afternoon, everybody. So as was pointed out by Sean, my name's Raquel Carter and I work for Energize Renewables, and we're pleased to have an invitation to come and speak today. I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of my experience, my regulatory experience when I was working for NOPSEMA in terms of mainly focused on the EPBC Act and that regulatory framework that is of course relevant to offshore energy projects in Australia. Next slide, please, Richie. Okay, so just a brief overview of the EPBC regulatory setting. Underwater noise being a key factor, I guess, for a lot of the offshore wind developments that are going to ensue. So under the EPBC Act, and I'm sure most of you already know this, but an action needs to be referred if it is likely to have or will have a significant impact on what's called a matter of national environmental significance. So what's pertinent, I guess, to offshore wind would be a national listed threatened species, and ecological communities, migratory species, and the Commonwealth Marine Area. In terms of what's in the Commonwealth Marine Area and what's protected, it's the definition of the environment. So ecosystems, their constituent parts, people and communities, natural and physical resources, the qualities of specific locations or places, heritage values of places, and then of what's really important there is to understand it's also the social, economic and cultural aspects of A to D that need to be considered. Under that framework, a person must not take an action that will have or is likely to have a significant impact without approval from the Minister of Environment, and that's why referrals are largely going to be needed for most, if not all, offshore wind farm developments in Australia. In addition to that, DECU has published some guidance, the key environmental factors guidance for offshore wind farms, which I was involved in back at NOPSEMA, when NOPSEMA was commissioned to support the writing of that guidance. So there's a fair bit of information on the key factors that DECU is expecting proponents consider during their EIA documentation. And then of important noting is that the Minister must not make a decision that is inconsistent with a recovery plan or threat abatement plan. And there's a couple of examples there of statutory recovery plans for the blue whale and southern right whale, which are really important context for informing environmental impact assessments. I think it's also important to note the precautionary principle and the principles of ESD, ecological sustainable development, that apply to minister decision-making processes under the EPBC Act, where scientific uncertainty and a threat of serious or irreversible harm means that a precautionary approach needs to be taken, the precautionary principle needs to be addressed. So at a high level, that's the framework. And then in terms of protection for whales specifically under that framework, you've obviously got the primary legislation being the EPBC Act itself as the statutory instrument, and then the regulations that support that. So under the EPBC regulations, that regulates any interaction with whales and other cetaceans where you don't already have an approval under Part 9 of the EPBC Act. So in terms of areas of protection for whales and marine mammals in Australia, marine parks, Australian marine parks protect quite a number of different species through the conservation values that are specific to each marine park, and also the zone objectives and prescriptions. And then specific to whales, the Australian Whale Sanctuary protects all cetaceans within Australian waters, which is depicted on the map. I mentioned recovery plans. The reason why they're really important, particularly for offshore developments, is that there are certain elements of these recovery plans which give an indication as to what may be an acceptable level or what might be an unacceptable level of impact, particularly when you're looking at key threatening processes that apply to specific species, and in this case, it's underwater noise will be a key factor there. And then you've got the level of policy and guidance and bioregional plans, all of which I guess are relevant pieces of context that will inform your environmental impact assessment and the types of surveys that you're going to need to be designing and executing in order to inform decision making. Well, a big part of the Australian regulatory framework here in Australia is the application of the mitigation hierarchy. And so what regulators are going to want to see is that you've exhausted the mitigation hierarchy and selecting the management measures you're going to apply to your project. Most importantly, from an underwater noise construction perspective, looking at avoiding the noise to begin with where you can, reducing would be the next stage down, managing residual impacts, and then offsets. Where proponents really want to be is in the area of avoid and reduce. It's really difficult, particularly under the existing framework, to manage the residual impacts when you've got large footprints. So what you want to do is really reduce noise footprints down to as low as you possibly can, and really exhausting options in the avoid and reduce parts of the mitigation hierarchy is going to be quite important. Next slide. Just to summarise the key challenges, which will then dovetail hopefully into the next talks, which will be more around survey design. Where are the challenges in Australia? Determining the acceptable level of impact specific to marine mammals, designing and executing baseline studies to provide the information needed to inform decision making. So it's really important at the early stages to start thinking about what are the questions the regulator needs answered, and how do I develop the scientific need to then answer that question. And doing that early is important to avoid unnecessary studies, or to make sure studies are tailored to answer the questions. Applying the mitigation hierarchy and being able to show and demonstrate that it's been applied. Building a case that impacts will be acceptable and not inconsistent with recovery plans or plans of management for marine parks. Demonstrating that there's been adequate regard given to relevant policies, guidance and marine bioregional plans. Addressing scientific uncertainty. We all know EIA is a practice and is not a certainty, so there's always going to be there areas of uncertainty that we're going to need to address. How do you address the uncertainty when it comes to residual impacts? There could be precautionary control measures applied, acquiring new information or science, or ongoing monitoring and adaptive management. So addressing scientific uncertainty is going to be quite important for any project. Designing post-approval monitoring and management programs to verify impacts were as predicted, and if they're not, what are proponents going to do about it? What happens if the acceptable levels of impact or performance outcomes are exceeded? What are your contingency measures then to deal with that? And then, of course, offsets, which are really challenging and difficult to do in the marine environment. So trying to avoid significant residual impacts in the first place would be the key. So in a nutshell, these are the key challenges for marine mammal impact assessment in Australia. And I will leave it there and hand over to the next speaker.
Thanks again, Raquel. I think that's been, that's extremely useful and extremely concise to what's very difficult to make concise. So that's excellent. Next slide, please, Richie. So yeah, I mean, I think really I agree with absolutely all of the key challenges that Raquel's put forward very eloquently there, and I think there's a couple. I've taken three of them or excerpts of three of them that I think are very critical to keep in mind when it comes to thinking about data collection in particular. And with that, I kind of consider that we have a toolbox of approaches for collecting those data. And as Raquel says, her introduction to this all dovetails really nicely into the next section, where Ali's going to chat to you about the aerial surveys, and then we've got Jonathan chatting about the boat-based surveys and biologging, and then Lorenzo chatting about the passive acoustic monitoring. So I'll leave it to those guys to work through that toolbox, and then I'll come back and chat to you after Lorenzo. Thanks, Ali.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ross. Back one slide, please. Thanks. So hi, everyone. My name's Ali. As Sean mentioned, I'm Associate Director in the Marine Wildlife Survey team based here in Perth in Australia. So today I'll be discussing the use of both digital and visual aerial surveys as techniques for understanding abundance, distribution, some behaviour and density of marine mammals, not only for baseline surveys, which is kind of what we're discussing, but pre and post construction or any other monitoring programme. I think what's very clear is that there's no one-size-fits-all survey to get all the information needed for a robust EIA, but both digital and visual aerial surveys offer a unique and kind of objective mechanism to gather some of that critical information. So one of the many benefits of digital, or DAS as I'll call it in particular, as you can see from the image before, is that our camera systems capture everything, so able to efficiently and effectively capture data not only on marine mammals but also other marine megafauna, birds and any incidental objects such as boats. So this makes it a very kind of effective form of metric to capture multiple pieces of information. So a little more about our DAS capability in Australia. We have a system of 3 cameras that provide 1.5 centimetres GSD, which is the distance between the centre point of adjacent pixels on the sea surface, and the resolution essentially. This method and resolution ensures that we reduce image distortion, while the orientation of the cameras pointed vertically down means we can capture images into the water column and see submerged marine mammals and other marine megafauna. We never have a set design, so every survey is designed bespoke to fit the question being asked, which is really important. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of those common methods in the next slide. But one of the key elements of DAS is highly accurate georeferencing for each individual, which allows us to capture critical information for calculating abundances. So we achieve this by having both GNSS and IMU units on board our aircraft, which calculate the exact altitude, roll, pitch and yaw of the plane when every image is taken, which is a fantastic innovation. Next slide, please. So a little bit about survey designs. For baseline characterization, we always recommend collecting 24 months of data, which allows us to assess interannual variability as well as seasonal fluctuations. We might also recommend increasing survey effort during key migration months of species such as humpback whales. Whilst there are a variety of potential coverage options, in our experience for site-specific baseline studies, 20% coverage balances quality and cost quite well. And specifically for marine mammals, we obviously capture those at, or in our case, below the sea surface, just below the sea surface. But we need to apply availability correction factors to more accurately represent the number of individuals in the area. We always have a buffer around the site, which we also survey. The minimum that we would recommend would be 4 kilometres, but we always mention the benefits of 10 kilometres, and we even do up to 20 kilometres, which is more appropriate for understanding marine mammal displacement from the site once the turbines are in the water. In relation to survey designs, we would either do a transect approach, whereby the plane flies in predetermined transects and images are collected and analysed continuously along the transect, or a grid design, whereby the plane flies predefined transects again and images are collected continuously, but only images within set grids are analysed. So a common design option, for example, would be either a 10% collection and 10% analysis of a transect design, or a 20% collection and 10% analysis of a grid-based design. So generally, while transects are suitable for large-scale regional surveys, we would recommend a grid-based approach for site-specific surveys, as it samples the area more evenly and has greater statistical power due to increased in sample sizes. Okay, next slide. So a quick example of this in action is Star of the South project, which was the first Australian offshore wind farm to conduct baseline surveys. So for this project, we provided 26 monthly surveys, with the first year being DAS only, and the second year combining our DAS system with our LiDAR system, which we've developed to accurately reflect bird flight heights. So the site and a 4-kilometre buffer were surveyed using a grid-based design of 20% collected coverage and 10% analysis. Slide, please. So as with all survey designs, there are benefits and limitations associated with this method. So one of the key benefits is that it provides a time and cost-effective approach to surveying large areas, where both bird and marine mammal data, marine megafauna data, and all incidentals can be collected simultaneously. It is a snapshot approach, but can be repeated and can be maintained pre and post construction, and it allows for high levels of QA at every stage in the process, from the plane right through all the data and image analysis. Due to the altitude of the plane, this method is completely non-invasive and critically does not affect the behavior of the animals, which reduces some of the biases inherent in some of the other methods. Some of the key limitations, obviously we only detect animals at this kind of surface and just below. So identifying those deep diving species that spend a lot of time underwater, which, although there are correction factors which we use, obviously limit somewhat the accuracy of the abundance estimates. And inherent in any aerial survey is that flights will only be conducted in suitable flying weather. And for those reasons, we look obviously to things like PAMs as supplementary data sets in that kind of toolbox approach that Ross was talking about. So visual aerial surveys, very quickly, they offer a targeted approach and complement DAS well. So these surveys have some similarities in the way they fly predefined transits. However, they differ in that they specifically target marine mammals with experienced marine mammal observers on board the aircraft, and they have a larger field of vision, allowing for increased survey coverage and more emphasis on behavior. So best practice ensures multiple observers to allow agreement on species ID. And the survey design can be tailored for the key species for the question being asked, and will often entail more survey effort during key migration months, for example. As with DAS, correction factors need to be applied due to the time spent individual spend submerged or diving, and distance analysis also needs to be used to correct for observers being able to see, obviously, more accurately in the immediate vicinity. Slide. Some of the benefits of visual aerial surveys is that they are economical over a large area and are more targeted to marine mammals. Relative to boats, they offer a kind of a more favourable viewpoint and clearer viewpoint of animals into the water column. Observers can see and ID species easily, and it's a repeatable, robust form of data collection. As with all survey methods, there are some limitations to visual aerial surveys. The success and accuracy of the survey is limited by the expertise of your observers, and observers over time, obviously, as with all people, susceptible to fatigue, as well as potential biases. Planes do fly significantly lower than DAS, which increases the risk from a health and safety perspective and limits the potential for post-construction comparisons due to the height of the turbine and the clearance needed. And the method also has the same limitation of detection rates and weather dependency as other aerial methods. So that's a very brief roundup of aerial methods, and I'll now pass on to Jono to talk about boat-based surveys and biologging.
Thanks, Ali, and good evening, morning, afternoon to everyone. Thanks also, Sean, for the introduction a bit earlier. So I'll cover off on boat-based surveys and biologging. You can jump to the next slide, please, Richie. So I'll start by saying that boat-based surveys have been around for a long time, and worldwide they're still a widely used method to collect data on marine mammal information at sea. And really, where we see value or opportunity in boat-based surveys for marine mammals is inevitably, for most of these projects, you're going to have a lot of vessel-based work going ahead. So in addition to bespoke or designated marine mammal surveys, it's quite easy to put a marine mammal observer on these vessels, and it's quite a cost-effective option. And this is particularly true for things like seabird surveys, which utilize very similar methodologies. So our approach to boat-based marine mammal surveys follows a fairly standard protocol where we use up to 2 observers that are put onto a suitable vessel with a good viewing platform, and they then undertake distance sampling along a predefined transit. This allows for density and abundance estimation, and in addition to that, species behavior is also recorded, and this is done in according to a predefined ethogram or list of behaviors. So essentially, what you're really collecting is some of the core information on distribution and abundance for marine mammals within your given study area. Next slide, please, Richie. So As Ali has quite rightly pointed out, there's no perfect method, which is why we look to a toolbox of methods. But some of the benefits of vessel-based surveys for marine mammals is, the slower travel speeds. So typically you have a high detection rate. I guess the flip side of that is that with these slower travel speeds, you're typically covering a lot smaller area compared to something like an aerial survey. The identification of tricky species is often possible when you've got skilled observers, because we're looking for things like species-specific surfacing patterns, and that can ultimately be, one of the main defining points for getting that positive ID. You can cover a range of spatial scales with vessel-based surveys, depending, of course, on the vessel that you use, which has cost implications. And as I mentioned, including a marine mammal observer on vessels that are undertaking other surveys, simple, it's cost effective. So ultimately, it's a really good supplementary method in this toolbox of survey approaches. On the flip side, some of the limitations of vessel-based surveys are, the noise coming from vessels that can deter certain species. Vessels themselves may also attract other species. There's also the risk of not identifying species that have cryptic surfacing behaviors. So having a look at the shepherd's beak whale in the corner and the Brutus whale in the middle, if those individuals were, surfacing in really rough conditions, you probably wouldn't be able to identify them or detect them. So you are quite limited in the actual conditions that you can survey. I've covered off on the slower travel speeds. And then ultimately, as Ali also pointed out with her previous slides, there's health and safety risks, both to the staff that are on vessels spending long days out at sea, and also some risk to the environment and actually to the animals themselves. So onto biologging, and Ross may have a bit to cover off on cetacean biologging when he sums everything up, but I'm going to focus only on seals. And this is for three main reasons. So firstly, we've got both Australian and New Zealand fur seals that either breed locally or utilize haul-out sites within the Gibson region. And this puts them into really close proximity to many of these offshore wind developments. Secondly, with seals being local foragers rather than just transients that move through the area, we really do need to understand their foraging distributions and behavior. And in our experience, that information we really struggle to get from methods other than biologging. And finally, why look at seals instead of looking at cetaceans? Because tracking land-based mammals like seals is a lot easier than tracking whales. So seal tracking studies will generally be focused at breeding colonies, and typically it's the lactating females that are targeted. They make up a really large component of the population. They're quite accessible when they're feeding their pups higher up on the shoreline. And during the period that they're feeding their pups, they're central place foragers. So they tend to forage a lot more locally, probably coming into contact or into the range of a lot of these offshore wind farms. And they also return regularly to the breeding colony, which means that you can often retrieve your very expensive devices. So to deploy biologging devices, animals are typically captured using approved techniques, and then often they're sedated, again, using only approved and acceptable techniques. The biologging device is then attached to the fur of the animal's left to go to sea, and then depending on the device that you've used, you either need to recapture the animal to download the data, or if they're satellite linked, which they often are nowadays, you can download a lot of that data remotely. The data that you will get from biologging, again, it depends on the device that you're using, but typically it's things like spatial distribution, habitat use, and behavioral data if you're using things like TDRs and accelerometers. Next slide, please, Richard. So again, there are benefits and limitations associated with biologging. Firstly, biologging, one of the benefits of biologging is that it provides really fine-scale data on foraging distributions and often various behavioral attributes. In comparison to many other methods, which provide a relatively brief snapshot when you're out at sea doing the surveys, biologging gives you data that covers a lot greater period, depending on how long you leave the device on the animal. It also provides information at both individual and population level, which it may become important to start identifying impacts at both the population and the individual level. And then finally, and probably less relevant in the EIA context, but worth a mention, is that habitat use information can ultimately be linked to environmental data, which can then go into developing predictive models. On the flip side, some of the limitations to biologging are, of course, that you need really skilled and experienced staff to do the work. It's not an easy task for just anyone to go out and do. It can be quite a costly exercise because the devices are often quite expensive. A lot of field time is required to do the deployments. And then probably the big clincher here is that the permitting and animal ethics requirements are quite onerous on this. And rightfully so, because you are catching and often sedating really large animals. So there's a lot of boxes that you do need to tick in that space. Another consideration here is, access to breeding colonies and the ethics around that, the ethics around how many animals can be deployed. And because of this, biologging, at least from a colony perspective, is something that lends itself more to a regional scale assessment. And then, of course, there are health and safety risks, both for the staff as well as the animals. Next slide, Richie. So I'll just sort of end off quite briefly by saying that there is a great deal of published information, often covering about multiple decades, particularly for Australian fur seals in the Bass Strait area. This information is primarily for females, so there is a bit of a knowledge gap for other components of the population, so things like your juveniles, non-breeding individuals and males, and then in general for New Zealand fur seals. But the positive take home here is that with advances in biologging technology, as well as advances in capture and sedation techniques, there are quite a few opportunities to address these gaps. So I'll leave it at that, and I will hand over to Lorenzo to talk about PAMs.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks very much for having me to speak today about passive acoustic monitoring for marine mammal detection during offshore industry activities. So just a little bit about Sage, first of all. So Sage, we're a UK-based company. We have a global reach and specialists in underwater sound monitoring and technology. So that's provision of technology and the whole management and development of underwater sound studies. Some of our core services include these underwater soundscape and noise modeling studies, including noise measurement within industry, and then the marine mammal baseline study surveys and monitoring, and then through to the mitigation stage. So we have a experience in offshore industry, initially through the years of oil and gas, moving into construction, and in the latest years, offshore renewables, including some of the world's largest wind farms. Next slide, please. So just to give a scale of our global reach, we have operations all over the world, including some large-scale monitoring projects currently in the UK and the Far East, and obviously with work in Australia and New Zealand, and also a lot in the US as well. Next slide, please. So there is this increasing need to monitor and report marine mammal baseline information, which is lacking, and that's particularly in the offshore areas, but is also really important for environmental impact assessment of human activities. And that's where PAM can become a really essential tool in the suite of technologies and methods that are available for informing these EIA processes. Some of the advantages of PAM as a utility: it enables long-term autonomous data collection of vociferous marine mammals, and compared with some conventional vessel-based surveys, it can be relatively inexpensive and can increase your spatial and temporal coverage. PAM, as we're moving through forward, there's always innovation, there's new technologies, and it's really about finding the best, most suitable opportunities to use these technologies in the most effective way in the context of EIA. Next slide, please. We can actually gather a lot of the baseline information that required for EIA purposes with relatively simple equipment, and this is equipment that's being used regularly around the world. In the image here, we have a diagram of a subsurface mooring system, which comprises a relatively simple acoustic release mechanism. And we mount on there we have options. We can mount a couple of different acoustic recording devices. In the context of baseline surveys, for multi-species surveys in areas that are particularly lacking in information, we might want to insert there a broadband acoustic recorder with an omnidirectional hydrophone, or in addition to that, we have the options of automated click detectors as well. And some of the advantages of these devices is that they can be deployed relatively simply from a vessel, relatively cost effectively. We can create arrays of these moorings and spread them over a large area to capture a lot of information about the regional activity. They can be deployed relatively long term with continuous or duty cycle methodologies, and leave them there for 3 to 6 months between service visits. Adjustable settings to suit the species of interest in the area, and really just to capture this wide net, so to speak, multi-species surveys allowing us to capture seasonal variation and occurrence. Next slide, please. So just as a couple of examples, recent study we have done in the Mozambique Channel off northwest Madagascar, we deployed an array of these subsurface moorings, and we're able to collect lots of data on baleen whales, particularly in this area. Lots of different types of localizations. We're able to inform this seasonal occurrence through this migratory channel, and this was enabled us to inform environmental assessment in that area. Some of the data analysis techniques for this can also be relatively straightforward using off-the-shelf software that we have, PAMGuard or Raven Pro. In PAMGuard, we look at the delphinid detections through whistles and clicks, or humpback song and sperm whale clicks as well. And in Raven Pro, we have signal processing techniques available, including these band-limited energy detectors, template detectors, and ever more increasing and useful machine learning AI-based model classifiers for stereotyped baleen whale call types. And the next slide, please. Closer to home at SAGE, we also have a long-term passive acoustic study off the east coast of the UK, and this one is a particularly relevant situation where it's in the midst of the ongoing and developing offshore wind sector. It's also in an area of special area of conservation for harbour porpoise. And our aim here is to really look at the long-term effects and the spatial temporal distribution of the marine mammals in that area in relation to the different phases of offshore wind construction and operation. And this survey here consists of these simple, an array of these seabed moorings. We have 12 of them, and we have this ongoing data collection, servicing, analysis, and reporting all through these years now and going forward through development. Next slide, please. So in the context of Australia, we would really want to look at this with a pragmatic approach and a layered approach. So we look at the baseline information that we require, first of all, using this wide cast net to gather us these multi-species surveys, the data of these multi-species surveys for spatial temporal occurrence. And these results can inform, more detailed complex studies on animal density and behavior, perhaps at targeted locations and habitats within the proposed offshore development areas. These surveys can be supplemented by, as mentioned before, these other survey techniques, boat-based surveys, including photo ID, the various aerial surveys, and also these acoustic methods as well. And as we progress through this development timeline, we can introduce these more complex monitoring techniques. And we're looking here at these autonomous vessels and perhaps offshore uncrewed survey vessels or acoustic glider units, or multi-sensor systems, multi-hydrophone systems, and seabed lander types or large aperture arrays to look at these density studies to give us population level information. Once these studies are then informing what are the sensitive species in these areas, we can then use that information to inform the detailed planning of these developments, and therefore onwards through to the mitigation phase, where we can introduce more passive acoustic techniques, including these real-time systems, localization techniques using and telemetry systems that can inform in near real time or real time to provide operational information to inform operational decisions. So I'll leave it at that for now, and thanks very much for having me. If you have any information, requiring any information, please do feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Yeah, I had a great overview, I think, from the speakers, and did pretty well. We've almost kept the time, but I will try and make a wee bit more time up here, just to give a wee bit of time for Q&A. So again, I think the guys kind of covered off quite importantly aspects of the pros and cons of each of the methods that we've presented here. And again, I'm drawing on what Raquel presented earlier on in the webinar, and those kind of 3 pertinent bullet points. And I think it's really important that we kind of keep in mind, what we're trying to achieve in this process, and that ultimately maximizes the value of the data that you gather. And I think what I've done is really kind of simplified that process in that kind of stepwise design on the right-hand side of the slide. And quite a few of the folks that have spoken already have kind of highlighted these approaches or this stepwise approach, if you like. But to summarize it, we would be spending a good bit of time doing that desk-based review, identifying priority species, and that could be in relation to their categorization in the EPBC Act, as well as spatio-temporal occurrence. Looking at those knowledge gaps, and I think John did a great job in demonstrating that with respect to the biologging, and that we've got a bias towards female lactating seals. So there's a key knowledge gap there if we want to understand, for example, what the adult males are doing. And then that comes into this designing the surveys and thinking about what might be primary and supplementary. And I think that probably links into some of the questions I've seen in the chat, in as much as, again, linking back to the pros and cons, I think you need to think like this kind of primary and supplementary, because if you try and design surveys under one of those methods for 2 different receptors, for example, then I think you devalue the data across both receptors. And I think that this also links into the concept of adaptive management, which Raquel's pulled in. I think you can probably circle around on that with regards to consideration of impact pathways. And how the scope of marks might change, or the envelope of the project might change over time, and bringing in that key element of stakeholder engagement as well. So can I get the next slide, please, Richie? Thanks. So yeah, I won't labor on this too much in the interest of time, but it links very much into the kind of regulatory pathways or what's underpinning that in Raquel's slide. So what we have is an example of impact pathways that you'll find in the DQ guidance relevant to marine mammals, and then the concept of how we might list the threatened species under that guidance. So for example, critically endangered and endangered species, they then have their significant impact criteria, which is an example. There's 3 bullet points there. So for those sorts of species like your pygmy blue whales, you would be looking at those significant impact criteria in line with those impact pathways. So really, I think it's very important that we think about this process at the early stages when you're designing surveys, and then that way you're more likely to get to the conclusion of something that's actually fit for purpose, i.e. producing a robust EIA. Thanks, Richie. Apologies, whizzing through these. So this is just like a hypothetical example, kind of bringing in what everybody's been chatting about previously. So where you've got that classification, you might consider passive acoustic monitoring to be the primary data source. And where we talk about that supplementary element, that can be brought in through what I would consider to be cross-receptor. So we can see that, for example, the priority species in this hypothetical example says use digital aerial surveys for ornithology, but we can then draw on data that we gather on those surveys for marine mammals to supplement aspects of the other survey methods to support that EIA process. Again, I think the biologging is another good one as an example, is based on a lot of the information that John has already shared, is that strategic that strategic element is kind of key. So there's a lot going on in biologging where we might think about collaboration with, say, academic partners and long-term studies to tackle that. So I do think that's all rather important to consider around things like data integration across these methods, such as biologging, getting information on dive times, for example, to maybe tackle some of these issues around availability bias with the visual and digital surveys, aerial and boat based. Thanks, Richie. And yeah, I guess I've just kind of put a bit of a brain dump on the last slide. But I think it's really important that we think about planning throughout all phases of the project from the start, you know, and those are listed out there. And the concepts of baseline monitoring and mitigation, the approaches to tackling them are likely to be different. And again, going back to Raquel and linking this back, you know, she's articulated well the mitigation hierarchy and things like adaptive management that will be key in that process, and we should be thinking about that at the start of the process, not midway through. And then I do think it's important that we should be considering strategic and collaborative solutions. Proportionate, pragmatic, and robust assessment can generate that. And ultimately, just we should definitely be avoiding collecting data for collecting data's sake. And a few of the guys have also highlighted that no one size fits all. So these surveys, even within those surveys, they should be bespoke to the questions being asked based on the process shown earlier, i.e. from the desk-based review through to that stakeholder engagement is going to be critical in designing those surveys. So I'll hand back over to Sean, slightly over time, Sean, apologies, but back to you.
That's quite all right, Ross. I think you did incredibly well there. So just firstly, thank you, everybody, Ali, Raquel, Lorenzo, Jono, Ross. Really good to hear all those. It's always a school day when we have a webinar. Fantastic knowledge coming out from this session. There have been a couple of questions coming through from the Q&A. But if I could just start with one I had myself, actually, and perhaps this is going directed really towards yourself, Ross, and Raquel, because it was really what really struck me from your own discussion there, Raquel, was how can you collect data that provides confidence to understand if an impact is acceptable or unacceptable? So that's a really key, crucial, it seems like the most critical part of the pathway, really. So I was wondering, of all the different methods we discussed today, then, where do you see the greatest value in integration in data across those survey methods?
Is that a question for me, Sean?
I think it's the whole panel, really. I mean, that's what it's for. Ross, you know, and Raquel, maybe you're the best place to answer those ones. That one.
I think at the end of the day, it's really important to firstly set your question. What is it you need to have answered? And it might be a multiple lines of evidence approach. It really just depends on what that question is. But from an Australian perspective, there's a lot of deficiency in what we understand about marine mammals in the Australian marine environment, particularly out in the areas where offshore developments are proposed. It's having enough information to understand, with a project being constructed and operated, what are the interactions going to be with the animals in the marine environment? What impact and risk pathways are going to be exposed to? Are these animals going to be exposed to? And why? What's the case made behind why those impacts are acceptable? Thinking about conservation status, population level impacts. Sometimes individual impacts will be quite important too. Depending on what the requirements are within, say, recovery plans, such as the one for blue whales. And so it's really important to start with what questions do I need answered, then mapping that then to, well, how can the data I collect answer whether or not an acceptable level of impact will be achieved. There is always going to be uncertainty, and making sure you design your surveys to address that uncertainty is going to be crucial, particularly if you have to go and if you get conditions imposed that talk about or that refer to ongoing monitoring and adaptive management. So you're going to need to design your programs to help in your post-approval compliance stage as well. I don't think that specifically answers the question for a particular species or survey type, but it kind of talks to the the general nature of having to be clear about what your question is to begin with.
No, thank you, Raquel. I suppose there's been a question come through on seals actually, and that's just in relation to their mobility, and some of the information has been collected globally on different seal species and sea lion species. And the question is really, it'd be great if the panel could discuss the pros and cons of biologging for seals for EIA purposes and other options that the industry could consider. So perhaps, Jono, bring you in on that one.
Yeah, it's a fair question, and that's exactly why I put the clincher in there of all the all the ethics and permitting issues around it. I think yes, we could argue that the risk to seals is low. I do think that we probably couldn't say that confidently, to be honest. If you take a species like an Australian fur seal that is a benthic forager, any work on the seabed, there's a potential that there's going to be impact there. So the only way really to get information to assist answering some of those questions is through biologging, in my opinion.
Thanks, Jono. That is really interesting. And there have been lots of studies that have come out to show, obviously, there's the difference in impacts, and mostly that's to do with the construction, but also that initial post-construction process where there may be damage to the habitats. The seals have a preference to be foraging in, and the recovery time for those habitats and their food that they're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's all true, and I think again it's good to draw comparisons to how it's done elsewhere and acknowledge the difference between both Australia and the species that we're talking about. But for EIA purposes, the telemetry data is largely what we lean on in Europe for these purposes. And typically it's a great example of that strategic approach as well. So it's basically pooling together a lot of telemetry tags and doing a meta-analysis on those data to understand the habitats and the amount of time seals are spending in areas. So that tends to be pulled through from that into that EIA, and that's work that's largely led by the Sea Mammal Research Unit over here in the UK, along with other partners in Europe that kind of regularly do that analysis and update that analysis to support that EIA process, as well as others. And I think just to kind of Raquel's points earlier, again, I think she's absolutely on the nose, unsurprisingly, about it. I think you're always going to have that uncertainty there, and I think that what we need to start to think about in Australia is how we build up that baseline in a strategic manner to kind of reduce that uncertainty over time, and we've definitely demonstrated that in other parts of the world, and we can draw on that a little bit from the UK. And yes, people will obviously make important comparisons there, or rather say different species, etc., different legislation. Of course it is, but we can demonstrate through strategic approaches to gathering data that we have reduced some of that uncertainty, and it's really important to do that at these foundation stages and think about how to approach that. And as we do that, we can start to get a little bit more confidence in the data that we're generating and the conclusions that we're making in the EIAs. So I think it's really a great opportunity to have these conversations, and really grateful for the panel to bring those together, and for the folks joining the call to engage and drop some of those questions in. So I think that's excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I just, bearing in mind in time, I'll just ask one final question, and just to reiterate, for anyone who missed it at the start, we will come back and answer all the questions that people have put forward, and provide that in a response, as well as the recording will be available for anyone who had to leave early, or if anyone who has to leave in the next minute, if you've got another Teams meeting or real meeting to go to, or you just, that's the end of your evening and you're with your family, or the start of the morning, whatever it might be. Just my final question is just, I suppose, going back to what Raquel said, and back to yourself, Ross, is really around how do you therefore identify the priority species when it comes to surveys and assessments? To what goes into that front end design process? What do you need to know? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to give an opinion to that. I think again, you are looking at the designation of that species through the regulatory framework, to my mind, so critically endangered, vulnerable, where you may not have that status. You can look to other things like IUCN red lists and things to try and understand a little bit more about those species and where they sit in that spectrum. And then I think you are integrating that into that desk-based review to understand what species occur in that area, spatiotemporal, and then ultimately identifying those knowledge gaps. And it's more of a matrices approach, I think, when you've got such a complex environment or a makeup of marine mammal species as Australia does. You've got key and critical times for most of these species in any location, be it migratory paths, breeding seasons. Key foraging areas are always going to play a part in this. So it's really trying to build up that matrix to try and then identify where you need to shore up that data to generate that robust impact assessment. So it's not as I say, it's not that simplified pathway, if you like. I kind of see it as more of a matrix type approach that would be ideally you would be designing that with key stakeholders at the table and adapting that as you generate the data if you feel that that's not fit for purpose and not generating that data over time. And that's why we would typically say something like a 2-year period to gather those data gives you that space to try and make sure that you are generating that data and thinking about carrying that through from the baseline site characterization stage into the monitoring stage as well. That's kind of my take on it. Very much welcome Raquel's too.
Thanks, Ross.
I think you've got to start with what's protected under the EPBC Act. And yes, you've got listed threatened species, listed migratory species, but also when you're looking at cetaceans, they're all protected as well in Australian waters. And then you also have the layer of Commonwealth Marine Area. Let's not forget it's all the ecosystems and constituent parts that are protected in the Commonwealth Marine Area, including listed marine species. So you have pretty much got the whole swathe of biodiversity values protected. Then it's about how do you prioritise? And I think that comes down to, well, what are the impact and risk pathways and what animals are likely to be more impacted than others and where are the gaps in information? So you will have to go through a process of prioritising, but at the end of the day, 2 really key instruments that the decision maker is going to have to consider is our recovery plans for threatened species and plans of management for protected areas. So having data or information and impact assessment to demonstrate why your project will not be inconsistent with those instruments, with those pieces of guidance that are statutory is really important. So you need to go to those pieces of guidance to see what essentially is the inherent acceptable level or unacceptable level of impact and work back from there. So I can't stress enough how important it is to understand what's in those documents and how they play into decision-making processes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Raquel, and thank you, Ross. I'm just going to ask one more because I know people are dropping off, but there are a number of people. There's a good enough number of people who've stuck around, so I think we can probably ask a few more questions. Well, one really, it's for yourself, Lorenzo. I suppose what are the biggest risks to data when carrying out long-term static PAM surveys?
Yeah, it's a good relevant question relating to PAM, especially when you're working in oceanic environment with technology. There's always the risk that there can be equipment failure or loss of data that way, either from equipment failing or in the operational aspect from deploying, recovering that equipment in sea conditions. So it's really important to build in redundancy within your study design to have enough of array of these recorders that can compensate. If you've had some loss in data at some point, you can fill that gap by obviously having redundancy in terms of the spread of the data collection, but also the regular service visits, timing that correctly, understanding how your recorders are working, collecting data, and knowing best how to time that in with the operational environment you're working in. Also collaboration with the developers, making sure that there's good notification, especially with other users of the sea, particularly fisheries, which can be an ongoing challenge for acoustic programs that have got equipment on the seabed and can be impacted by fisheries. So that's a really important thing to think about. And just to make sure that communication line's open and understood as well throughout the long-term study programming. So I'd say that's the main things.
Thank you, Roger. No, that was brilliant. I will attempt to wrap it up then. I mean, essentially, thank you all again. Thanks everybody also for tuning in for this, the third webinar that we've done for the Australian support, the Australian offshore wind industry. We are looking to do further ones into the future. Our next one will likely look at the cumulative effects and how we can take some of the lessons learned from a European and global perspective and bring that to have a review and look at the implications of what we have into the future here, particularly in Gippsland, where there's 12 proposed projects in an area which is very similar scale to the southern North Sea, if you look at it on a map. But really, it's just, thanks everybody for the presentations. But real key points there in understanding what the key issues are going to be for your EIA, which species you need to then focus on, the protected species in the region where you might be, and then trying to then take about on the survey design to ensure that you incorporate the right methods and the right techniques to have as much data really as possible. And that really seems to be the key here, is that it's a toolbox, as Ross had said. It's about making sure that you can reduce those uncertainties as best as possible to provide a confident assessment of the potential impacts from an offshore wind farm, particularly that construction phase, when foundations be put into the seabed, and really just ensuring, I suppose the main message is that your data are fit for purpose, and with it being a 2-year program, it's about making sure you start that program off in the best possible manner so that you don't waste time and lose time at the back end. So just once again, I mean, thank you very much again. So thanks, Ross. Thanks, Ali. Thanks, Lorenzo, Raquel, and Jono. Thanks, everybody, for turning up today. As I said, the recording will be available hopefully next week for you. And look out for the next one that will be due later on this year. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you.